black woman deceived for 20 years behind my marriage hid a truth darker, colder, and more shocking than anyone could imagine. When the mask finally fell, what I discovered did not just break my heart, it shattered everything I thought I knew about love and family. Stay with me until the very end of this video, because the secret I uncovered changes everything. And before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. At 38, Boney carried herself like a woman carved out of granite and fire. Her skin was the color of polished mahogany, her eyes sharp as if they had memorized every betrayal history had written on black women's backs. She wasn't just a businesswoman, she was a force. The kind of figure who turned heads when she entered a room, not because of beauty in the conventional sense, but because she radiated command. The world knew her as the proud owner of a growing chain of restaurants, places where the aroma of her grandmother's recipes seeped into the air like gospel. Customers didn't just eat her food, they inhaled the story of survival, migration, and grit. Yet inside that fortress of success, Bonnie carried a silence that fame could not soothe. She went home after closing hours to a sprawling but hollow house, where the polished marble countertops whispered back her loneliness. For all her triumphs, she had no one waiting for her in the dark. Her staff called her boss lady. Newspapers hailed her as a self-made queen. But when the applause died down, the emptiness pressed heavier than the crowns. It was on an ordinary afternoon, in one of her smaller restaurants on the edge of town, that Joss appeared. He was a white man in his 40s, hired for the night shift, his resume thin and his spirit thinner. Divorced, broke, carrying the weight of 2 children from a past marriage. He looked like someone already discarded by life. But he had a trick, an easy smile that could disguise hunger, a voice soft enough to slip into unguarded hearts. The first time he held the door open for her, his words were disarmingly simple. "You deserve someone to do that for you." It wasn't the line itself, but the way it sliced through her armor, that made Boney pause. For years she had been praised, feared, envied, but rarely cherished. Jones began weaving himself into her days with calculated patience. A coffee delivered without being asked, a compliment about her resilience, a shared story about being broken yet hopeful. Her friends raised their eyebrows. "Boney, don't you see? He's looking for a lifeboat, and you're the ocean." But the more they warned, the more fiercely she clung to the hope that love, real love, might finally be hers. She wasn't naive, she was hungry. Hungry for a hand to hold, for a family to build, for a man who saw more than her balance sheets. Within 3 months, the improbable happened. Boney, the woman who built an empire, brick by brick, agreed to marry a man who owned nothing but debts and promises. She told herself it was courage, the same kind that had driven her ancestors to cross rivers they weren't supposed to survive. She believed her heart, not her bank account, was the real gamble. The wedding was small but intimate. A handful of relatives, a scattering of employees, the preacher's voice echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling of a modest church. Johns looked at her with a tenderness that melted her doubts, while his children clutched her hands as though they already belonged to her. In that moment, Boney believed she was stepping into the life she had long been denied, the warmth of belonging, the safety of love. But even as she said, "I do," a shadow stirred beneath the boughs. It wasn't loud, not yet. It was a whisper of imbalance. The guests noticed how Jones flinched when the waiter poured champagne into crystal glasses Boney had paid for, how his eyes lingered too long on the grandeur he hadn't built. Still, Boney silenced the suspicion rising in her chest. After all, hadn't she fought all her life against people judging her worth by the color of her skin, by the poverty she had climbed out of? She refused to judge him now by what he lacked. What she didn't see, what she couldn't see, was the quiet hunger in Jonas's gaze. It wasn't the hunger of a man for a woman. It was the hunger of a man staring at an unlocked vault. And for all her strength, Bonnie carried the one vulnerability that even power couldn't shield, the belief that love could rewrite the cruel script of history. The newspapers would later call her reckless. Her business partners would whisper about the danger of merging her fortune with a man unworthy of her name. But in that first year, Bonnie didn't hear the warnings. She was too busy pouring herself into the role of wife, too busy trying to stitch together a fractured family, too busy convincing herself that the dream was real. And it seemed real at first. Dinners around the table with Johns and his children, laughter that filled the walls, moments that felt borrowed from the life she thought was forever out of reach. But underneath the laughter, a tension was building, coiling tight, waiting for the day when the surface would crack. Because in America, where a black woman's success is often read as arrogance, where her wealth is treated as something she must justify, Boney had dared to believe she could also be loved without condition. And that belief, the most human, the most dangerous, was about to be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The house was warm, the vows still fresh, the laughter still sweet. But somewhere in the silence between the cracks, the question lingered. Was Johnch her salvation or the beginning of her undoing? Marriage with Johnch unfolded like a story written in invisible ink, at first unreadable, later terrifyingly clear. From the outside, the picture looked whole. A family sitting around the dinner table, laughter scattering into the air like sparks. A woman in her prime standing at the head of a growing empire. A man leaning into her light. But beneath the varnish, reality pulsed darker, quieter, and far more costly. Jones brought home paychecks so thin they disappeared in the shadow of the bills. His wages covered almost nothing, not the mortgage, not the children's tuition, not the groceries that stacked in the pantry. The house they lived in, the very roof under which his children found shelter, belonged entirely to Boney. And yet, when the neighbors waved from across the manicured lawns, they saw not a transaction but a family. No one imagined that every brick, every gallon of gas in the car, every pair of shoes on the children's feet came from Boney's unrelenting labor. Still, she carried it all with the silence of someone determined to prove love could rewrite the narrative. She had known poverty too intimately in her childhood, had watched her own mother count coins on a kitchen table while the world outside pretended not to see. So when she looked at Jones's children, she refused to see them as burdens or reminders of another woman. She saw only the chance to give them what she herself had once prayed for: stability, opportunity, a home where the lights never flickered off because the bills went unpaid. She packed their lunches before dawn, signed their permission slips, sat in the front row of every school play, applauded until her palms stung. To them, she was simply Boney. Never quite mother, never simply stepmother, something in between, something harder. The children accepted her care as if it were oxygen, invisible, expected, never questioned. They wore designer jackets to school, vacationed on summer trips abroad, carried cell phones when other kids still begged for one, all of it courtesy of Boney, though her name was rarely spoken when the blessings were tallied. At the restaurants, she was a visionary. She opened 2 more locations within the first 5 years of marriage, then 4 more by the end of the decade. Her grandmother's recipes, sharpened by her own business acumen, became the signature of the brand. Magazines wrote about her as the embodiment of the American dream, a black woman who turned heritage into empire, tradition into triumph. She smiled for the photographs, stood in front of camera crews, shook hands with governors and mayors. But when the lights dimmed and the applause faded, she drove home to a family who mistook her empire for a bottomless well. Johns adjusted easily to the comfort. The man who once muttered about debts now leaned back in leather chairs, sipping wine poured from bottles he hadn't bought. He stopped talking about getting a second job, stopped pretending his salary mattered. Why would he? Everything was handled, covered, carried by the woman he called wife. At barbecues and gatherings, he bragged about his children's private schools, about their vacations to Florida beaches and California vineyards, without acknowledging the hands that paid for them. Boney noticed, of course. She always noticed. But each time the sting of silence cut through her, she stitched it over with the same thought. This is love. Real love asks for sacrifice. She believed that if she kept pouring herself into the cracks, eventually the vessel would hold. She lived in constant duality, a titan in the daylight, a servant to love in the evening. She would close $1-million deals by noon, then stand at the stove by night, stirring gumbo while the children lounged with their devices. She convinced herself this was balance. This was family. This was the wholeness she had been missing. There were moments fleeting but sharp when the mask slipped. When Johnson's son referred to the house as Dad's place while showing a friend around. When the daughter rolled her eyes and muttered that Boney tried too hard. moments when Boney's chest tightened with something dangerously close to rage. But she swallowed it, reminding herself that love was patient, that trust was the foundation she had promised to build upon. And so the years stretched. 1, 5, 10, then 20. Her hair silvered at the edges, her face etched with lines of both laughter and exhaustion. The restaurants multiplied, the profits soared, and her reputation solidified into legend. To the world she was unstoppable. To her family she was indispensable. Yet in the solitude of her bedroom, where no one applauded, she whispered the same question into the dark. If I disappeared tomorrow, would they remember me as love or as provision? Her sacrifices were invisible precisely because they were relentless. She had given so much, so consistently, that the extraordinary looked ordinary. No one could see the woman behind the empire standing barefoot in her kitchen at 2 a.m., writing checks for tuition while bills from suppliers lay stacked on the counter. No one could feel the ache in her bones as she carried both her family and her business on shoulders that never bowed. This was the paradox of Boney's life. She had everything, and yet she was always giving it away. She believed, stubbornly, that devotion could transform obligation into gratitude, that by loving these children as her own, by building a sanctuary where Johns could finally rest, she could prove wrong every doubter who had warned her. But deep down, hidden even from herself, a storm was gathering. The sacrifices that bound her family together were the very blindfold that kept her from seeing the truth. For 20 years, she told herself love was the reason. What if love was only the disguise? The question lingered, silent and unspoken, waiting like thunder in the distance. That night began like 100 others, but it carried a secret weight Boney could not have guessed. She had finished her inspections ahead of schedule, the last restaurant closing without the usual list of crises. For once, the paperwork could wait. She slipped behind the wheel of her car, exhausted but strangely light, and decided to do something she hadn't done in years: come home early, unannounced. The thought made her smile. She pictured Johns in the living room, maybe half asleep in front of the television, the glow of the screen bouncing across his face. She imagined the kids, though grown now. They often stopped by, lounging around, bickering good-naturedly. She saw herself walking through the door, catching them by surprise, the warmth of home rising up to meet her. It had been too long since she'd given them that kind of simple joy. Tonight, she thought, she would be the one bringing the gift. She didn't call. She wanted the surprise intact. The drive was quiet, the streets half asleep under the streetlights. By the time she pulled into the driveway, a sense of anticipation had wrapped around her. The house, her house, glowed softly against the night sky. It looked beautiful, safe, solid, the kind of home she had once only dreamed of as a little girl, pressing her face to windows she could never afford to enter. Boney stepped inside, careful with her heels against the tile. The air was warm, scented faintly with the roast she had prepared the night before. She set her keys on the console table, but before she could call out, a sound reached her. Voices, low at first, drifting from the living room. She froze, tilting her head. It wasn't unusual to hear laughter in her house, but there was something in the tone, an edge too sharp, too cutting. She moved quietly, her body instinctively cautious, like prey sensing the predator before it sees it. She walked down the hallway, her hand brushing against the wall as if to steady herself. And then she heard it, Jones's voice, the same voice that once whispered promises in the dim light of a cheap apartment, now heavy with calculation. Just a few more years, he said almost casually, and everything she owns will be ours. She doesn't have children, so who else is there? The restaurants, the house, all of it will come straight to us. The words landed like a blade between her ribs. Boney froze in the shadows, her breath caught. For a moment she thought she had misheard, but then her stepson's voice cut through, smug and merciless. Exactly what I've been saying all along. She's nothing but a money machine. All these years, every bill, every luxury, she covered it all. We just keep up the act until she hands it over. A hollow laughter filled the room. Bonnie's hands trembled at her sides, the keys digging into her palm, but she couldn't move. Then came the daughter, her voice quieter, but cruel in its honesty. I never thought of her as a mom, not once. She's just someone playing house. I don't care how hard she tried, it's not real. I'm just waiting for the inheritance. Laughter again, louder this time, rolling through the house like thunder. The three of them, bound together in greed, mocking the woman who had built their lives with her own hands. Bonnie pressed against the wall, her body shaking though the room was warm. Her mind raced through 20 years of sacrifice, the tuition check signed in the dead of night, the vacation she had planned so carefully, the meals she had cooked after 14-hour shifts. Every moment replayed itself, not as devotion but as evidence of her blindness. She wanted to scream, to burst into the room and demand they face her. She wanted to ask if they remembered the Christmas mornings she stayed up all night wrapping gifts, the hospital visits when she held their hands, the countless days she had worn herself thin so they could live whole. She wanted to shout until her voice broke, but she didn't move. Not yet. Instead, she stood there in the shadows, listening as the truth unraveled like a rope snapping thread by thread. She realized if she walked in now, they would deny it. They would smile, twist their words, paint her as paranoid, and worse, she might believe them. That was the cruelty of betrayal that made you doubt your own senses. So she swallowed the rage, forcing herself to breathe. Her face burned hot, but her eyes were cold, sharp with a clarity she had never known before. Bonnie turned, walking silently back down the hall, each step deliberate. In her bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the dark. The house around her felt foreign now, like a stage where every laugh, every hug, every moment of supposed family had been nothing more than a rehearsed performance. She didn't cry. She wouldn't. She had wept too many tears in her youth when no one came to her aid. Now, she understood what strength demanded. It wasn't the absence of pain, it was the decision to bear it without letting it break you. The betrayal of that night didn't just wound her, it remade her. Every word she had overheard seared itself into her bones. She knew now that love had been the mask, family the illusion, devotion the trap. And as she lay back in the quiet of her room, one thought crystallized with merciless clarity. If they had written her story for 20 years, tonight she would begin rewriting the ending. The recording lay hidden in Bonnie's desk drawer, its silence heavier than any weapon. She had played it only once, just long enough to hear again the cruelty of their laughter, the cold arithmetic of their betrayal. Her husband and his children spoke of her as though she were not flesh and blood, but a bank account with a pulse. The device had captured it all. But Bonnie knew better than to believe that one tape could end a marriage built over 2 decades. In a courtroom, words could be twisted, their venom disguised as jokes, their intent muddied in the theater of cross-examination. She needed more, and so Bonnie slipped into a role she had never imagined for herself, spy in her own home. Each day, she performed her part, the devoted wife, the steady provider, the woman too preoccupied with her empire to notice the small betrayals around her. She smiled when John spoke, nodded at the children's dismissive chatter, laughed when laughter was required. But behind her steady gaze, she was watching, recording, remembering. John grew careless, as men often do when they mistake loyalty for blindness. He began taking longer drives, leaving the house in pressed shirts and cologne on days that should have been ordinary. He claimed errands, shifts, meetings. But Bonnie had spent her life studying patterns in her kitchens, in her employees, in her business partners. And now she studied him with the same relentless precision. The first night she followed him, her hands trembled against the steering wheel. She kept her distance, headlights dimmed, her heart pounding like a drumbeat in her chest. He did not drive toward the restaurant as he had said. He drove into the city, to a bar that pulsed with neon light, the kind of place men went not to work but to escape. Bonnie waited. The door opened, and there he was, stepping out with a woman younger, polished, her arm looped through his as if she belonged to him. Bonnie's breath caught. She lifted her phone, recording as he kissed the woman openly, as though her existence, their 20 years together, had never mattered. The evidence burned cold in her hand. It was not just betrayal, it was proof, irrefutable. Still, she did not confront him. Not yet. She knew the danger of moving too quickly. To accuse, without strategy, was to risk losing everything she had built. If she walked into court tomorrow with only rage, She would hand him the chance to play the victim, to muddy her clarity with charm and practice lies. So she waited. She collected. She became meticulous, documenting his absences, his indulgences, the way money left their accounts without explanation. She hired no private investigator, trusted no one with her plan. This was her war, and she would fight it alone. The photographs, the recordings, the receipts, all of it gathered into a quiet arsenal. Each piece of evidence a stone she would one day hurl with deadly precision. At night, she sat at her desk with her lamp burning low. The papers spread before her were no longer just business documents. They were her blueprint for freedom. She studied legal precedents, whispered questions to her lawyer under the guise of routine consultations, learned how men like Jones had walked away with fortunes they never earned. She would not be one of those women. She would not be left broken. She began to move her empire in silence. Not entirely, not yet, but piece by piece, she shifted her company's assets, folding them under the protection of her sister's name. On paper, it was only business restructuring, a routine safeguard. In truth, it was the slow and steady building of a fortress, a way to ensure that when the storm finally broke, Johns would leave with nothing but the clothes on his back. In the daylight, she played her part with flawless grace. She cooked meals, asked about schedules, entertained friends at dinner. The neighbors saw nothing but harmony. Even Johns remained convinced she was the same woman, loyal and blind. He kissed her cheek with the same practiced affection, never noticing the steel in her eyes when he turned away. But in the quiet hours, when the house had fallen asleep, Boney whispered her truth into the dark. I know who you are. I know what you've done. And when the day comes, you will not see me breaking, you will see me rising. Every smile she gave him now carried a secret edge. Every word of affection was laced with patience, patience sharpened into a blade. She lived each day in the shadow of betrayal, but not as its victim. She was its witness, its recorder, its avenger in waiting. The proof was stacking. The betrayal was undeniable. And one day, when the moment was right, she would carry it all into the courtroom, not as a woman scorned, but as a woman armed with the truth. Until then, Boney played her role, calm, unshaken, invisible in her fury. The silence was not weakness. It was the storm gathering. The papers hit the table like thunder. Contracts, transfers, deeds, signatures. Her empire spread across the oak like a battlefield map. Boney's voice followed, steady and unshakable, slicing through the air before Johns could even gather himself. It's over. The restaurants, the properties, every ounce of what I've built, none of it belongs to you. It never did. For a heartbeat, silence roared. Then Jones laughed. Too loud, too brittle. You're bluffing. After 20 years, after everything I gave, you gave nothing. Her words cut him down, each syllable honed like glass. Every mortgage, every tuition check, every meal in this house came from me. You brought need and I carried it. You brought lies and I believed them. But I will not carry you any more. His face twisted, desperate to find the charm that had once disarmed her. Boney, listen what you overheard. She leaned forward, eyes locked on him. I didn't just overhear. I recorded it. Every word. You and your children laughing at me, planning what to take when I was gone. Do you want to hear yourselves call me a money machine again? Or should I play the video of you kissing another woman while I was here building the life you pretended to share? Color drained from his face. The children shifted in their chairs, suddenly smaller, suddenly afraid. The mask had cracked, and the man beneath it looked nothing like the one who had charmed her 20 years ago. You set me up, he spat, reaching for anger. No, Boney answered, calm as the strike of a judge's gavel. You set yourself up. I just stopped closing my eyes. She slid the divorce papers across the table, the final stroke in her symphony of evidence. Sign them, or don't. Either way, the court will. I have proof, and I have already moved everything beyond your reach. You walk away with nothing but your lies. He slammed his fist against the wood, but the sound rang hollow. You'll regret this. Her laugh was low, sharp, almost gentle in its finality. Regret? My only regret is giving you 20 years you didn't deserve. She straightened, her figure casting a shadow long enough to swallow his. You thought love made me blind. It didn't. It made me patient. And patience is the weapon you never saw coming. The children tried to speak, excuses tumbling from their lips, but she raised her hand and silenced them. You had a mother's love without the pain of being born from me. You had shelter, safety, privilege, all given freely. And still you chose greed. You chose cruelty. Do not mistake my silence for forgiveness. The debt is paid. Your inheritance is gone. The weight of her words hung in the air like a storm refusing to pass. Jones's defiance collapsed into desperation, his voice cracking. You can't throw me away like this. I already did, she said, rising, her chair scraping against the floor with the finality of a cell door closing. You just hadn't noticed. And with that, she left him staring at the ruins of his illusion, the man who thought he owned her future, now holding nothing but the echo of his own betrayal. The days that followed rewrote everything. Boney walked back into her restaurants, not as a woman who had been broken, but as one who had burned away the lies. She expanded, rebuilt, and with her sister and niece at her side, turned her empire into something even greater than profit. Wages rose, scholarships were funded. Young chefs who reminded her of herself, hungry, overlooked, underestimated, were given the chances no one had given her. The empire thrived because it was finally free of the rot that had tried to consume it. Jones and his children, once cushioned by her labor, slipped into the gravity of reality. The house disappeared. The luxury dried up. They had to learn what it meant to pay their own way, to live without the endless well they had mocked. The city that had once welcomed them turned its gaze away, and in every corner their fall whispered the same truth. You cannot live forever on stolen strength. But Boney did not watch them fall. She had no need. Her eyes were on the future, clear and unclouded for the first time in decades. When people asked how she had endured, she told them simply, family cannot be built on lies and greed. Her words became more than a verdict. They became her creed, her legacy. And in the quiet of her office, the light spilling across the desk she no longer had to share, Boney understood at last what freedom felt like. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was the absence of change she had carried too long. And somewhere in the silence, as if the world itself exhaled, Boney whispered into the air, I am finally free. The night after it all unraveled, Boney sat alone in her restaurant, the place that had carried her through every storm. The kitchen was silent, the lights dim, but the air still smelled faintly of garlic, pepper, and the sweat of her labor. She traced her fingers across the wood counter, feeling every groove carved by time, and let the weight of 20 years press down on her chest. She had been betrayed, not just by a man she once loved, but by an idea she had clung to, that sacrifice would be repaid with devotion, that love could be proven through endurance. For 20 years, she had poured herself into Jones and his children, raising them as if they were her own, building a fortune large enough to shelter them all. And yet, behind her back, they had mocked her, plotted around her, waited for her to die so they could feast on her legacy. They thought she was blind. They thought she was weak. But they underestimated the one truth about Boney. She was never weak. What they mistook for blindness was mercy. What they mistook for silence was patience. And patience, when broken, can turn sharper than glass. Boney had seen through their charade. She had collected her evidence, moved her assets, prepared her escape. When the time came, she had confronted them with papers that shattered their illusions, documents transferring her empire beyond their reach, a divorce decree waiting for a signature. And with a steady voice, she had declared the truth. A family cannot be built on greed and deceit. At patient, the words still echoed in her mind. They were not only for Johns and his children. They were for every woman who had ever been told her love should be endless, her forgiveness infinite, her worth measured only by how much she endured. Boney knew now that endurance without respect is a slow death, and she refused to die that way. Was she angry? Yes. Was she heartbroken? Beyond measure. But beneath the wreckage, she also felt something stronger, rising relief. She had lost illusions, but not herself. She had risked everything for love, and though the gamble failed, she had survived with her dignity, her business, and her legacy intact. That, she realized, was victory. Standing in the empty restaurant, she tilted her chin toward the faint light spilling in from the street lamp. She no longer mourned what she had lost. Instead, she celebrated what she had reclaimed, her freedom. For women like her, betrayal is never the end. It is a doorway. The world might expect them to crumble, but Boney had chosen differently. She had chosen to walk through the fire and emerge whole. The scars she carried were not marks of weakness, they were proof of her strength. She whispered into the quiet, as if to every woman who might one day stand in her shoes. Being deceived does not make us powerless. Staying deceived does. The courage to lead, to rebuild, to believe again, that is where our true power lives. Boney turned off the last light, locked the door, and stepped into the night. The darkness no longer felt like loss. It felt like possibility. And for the first time in 20 years, the future belonged entirely to her. Betrayal is painful, but worse than betrayal is living blind to it for a lifetime. Boney learned that sacrifice without respect is not love, it is self-erasure. For 20 years she gave everything, her money, her strength, her heart. Yet behind her back those she cherished mocked her, waiting to inherit what she had built. But Boney refused to let betrayal define her. She discovered that true power is not in how long we endure chains, but in the moment we decide to break them. She walked away with her dignity intact, her legacy protected, and her spirit unbroken. Her story is not just about one marriage, it is a mirror for all of us. Love without truth corrodes, and loyalty to lies is not virtue. The courage to leave is sometimes the deepest act of love we can give ourselves. So the lesson is clear. We may all be deceived, but we are never powerless. The future does not end when someone fails us. It waits brighter beyond the moment we let go. To hold on is human. To release, to rebuild, to believe again, that is strength. And maybe the most beautiful truth Boney leaves us is this. Betrayal is not the end of your story. It can be the beginning of your freedom. If this is your first time visiting our channel, or if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And tell us in the comments. Thank you for watching. May you carry this reminder into your own life, because the best is not behind you. It is still ahead, waiting.